Good morning, U.S. history students. We're on a new unit, which is the Progressive Era. And that's an era that goes from about 1890 to 1920. And for this unit, I kind of put a bigger overall focus question. You're never going to have to directly answer it on a test, but it's kind of just what is this time period about? So the question is, why did Americans support economic, social, and political reform, and what impact did these reforms have? So this kind of goes through each of the sections. Um, the time period before the Progressive Era was known as the Gilded Age, and within this Gilded Age context, there's a party that rises up, a third party called the Populist Party. Initially, it isn't run by this gentleman down below, William Jennings Bryan, but by 1896, the Populist Party effectively takes over the Democratic Party, and William Jennings Bryan runs for president under the Democratic ticket as what's known as a populist candidate. The word populist effectively means the same thing as democratic, just in English. Pop meaning people, ist is effectively rule of, or by the will of people. So he's advocating for a more populous United States and says he's speaking on behalf of the people. His most famous speech was the Cross of Gold speech, which this is a kind of the shortest excerpt I think is useful to look at right here. You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. And so what William Jennings Bryan is saying in this is basically, using Christian imagery, so brow of labor, I'm sorry, crown of thorns, was put on Jesus' head when he's crucified in the biblical story of his crucifixion, a story that would be familiar to all of his listeners. Labor, that's anybody who works. And then the second bit, you shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. So don't put on labor's head a crown of thorns, don't sacrifice them, do not crucify mankind. He's saying that the people, the populace, are, who mankind is labor. And you don't want to basically sacrifice them for money. So, in other words, support the laboring masses, do not support the incredibly wealthy. And again, in the Gilded Age, the robber barons and captains of industry conversation we had indicates there's quite a few people who have gotten very, very wealthy, and many at the expense of the vast majority of people. By the way, these are the only two photographs of William Jennings Bryan that exist from when he was running for president. And they both look very different. Just to show you how much an angle makes a difference. Let's get this. Why isn't it clicking? There we go. These are two very different perspectives on the Cross of Gold speech. The one on the left is an anti-William Jennings Bryan cartoon, which basically shows him using religion to sell his populist ideas. And there's a line in the speech where he basically says, he's from Nebraska, so he partially believes that labor is really farmers. If you burn down all the cities and you leave our farms, then the cities will pop up back like mushrooms, scaring the bejesus out of everybody in the cities. And so this magazine published in New York, Judge, made this image of him basically being this scary radical populist, claiming to speak for the people, but really advocating anarchy, as the guy in the background, his flag says. This is red flag of anarchy. At the Democratic Convention, his Cross of Gold speech was so popular that he was lifted up on the shoulders of the delegates in the convention and, basically carried out under, really exciting exclamation. And so this is when populist ideas become part of the Democratic Party, which up until 1896 had really been the party of white supremacy exclusively and the Ku Klux Klan, as well as the South. So this expands who might think of themselves as a Democrat, which is a change. I love this cartoon because it's super, super creepy. It's William Jennings Bryan's head. He is the Populist Party. So again, the Populist Party was a third party that ran independently and then eventually absorbs the Democratic Party in a sense, or is absorbed by. This cartoon is making the argument that the populist ideas are so powerful that no matter, the fact that it's Bryan running under the Democratic ticket, it's still the Populist Party running the show. When third parties run for president, they don't win. And that's just how the math ends up working. This is the best I can find in the modern era of a third party running for president and actually winning some states. So if you look, we just did a presidential election, so I hope you're familiar with the Electoral College. The Populist Party, this third party, won one, two, three, four, and a couple delegates in 5 and 6 states. So in 6 states, they won some electoral votes. Beyond that, they got shellacked. And so you can see in the Electoral College, they only got 5%. The Democratic Party, won this election, but, and let me flip it, 1896, you can see all those populist states go over to the Democratic side. The Republicans still win the election, but it's a much closer to kind of a modern map that you might recognize. You keep the colors the same, or you flip the colors, and this looks rather similar to the election of 2020 or 2016's map. So this election of 1896 establishes populism as a force in national politics, and also much of the voting patterns that we still live with today when we talk about swing states and where each party is strong and that sort of thing. All right. In 1904, this is a county by county map of Theodore Roosevelt's election, and you can see the same pattern. The Republicans are strongest in the Northeast, except for one big difference, which is Teddy Roosevelt was also a populist. So the Democratic Party takes in populist ideas in 1896. By 1904, the Republican Party also takes in these populist ideas, and each group claims to speak for the people, the common people directly. And it worked for Teddy because he won, effectively everything in the United States except for the old Confederacy in the South. So, all that being said, that's kind of our populist prelude. This section is about the progressive era and the drive for reform. So, the focus question for this 17.1 is, why did progressives, I got to put an S on that, focus on the areas they did and were they effective in addressing them? So, in this Gilded Age time period, there's lots of problems, one of which is, you can see by this chart, there is no income tax, and there's no way to fund many of the mechanisms of the federal government. So back in 1913, at the beginning of the progressive era, the income tax on the richest people in the country is less than 10% of their income. Progressive era policies make it jump up hugely to nearly 80%, drops back down during the 1920s when basically pro-business Republicans come to power. New Deal goes up to nearly 100%. And then we live in an era that is kind of halfway in between the 1920s and the progressive era of the New Deal as far as tax rates are concerned. It's actually, this chart is out of date. So the Trump administration and Congress passed some tax cuts. And so we're probably closer to the 1920s levels of income taxing. This is basically showing income shares. There's extreme income inequality. This is worth taking a closer look at just kind of on your own. But what I'll tell you is over time, in the progressive era, the rich were getting richer, the poor were getting poorer, and there's a similar pattern happening today. And a similar pattern happened in the late 1920s as well. This is a video about child labor. The Breaker Boys in the title, and again, I would recommend you watch this on your own. Imagine you are, I don't know, how old do you think this kid is? 5 to 10, probably a little, on the younger end of the spectrum. You've got tiny, tiny hands, and you can fit in small, small spaces like coal mine shafts. The Breaker Boys' job is they would effectively take what was a cast iron potato masher on a conveyor belt, and the big chunks of coal, they would smash into smaller chunks of coal for 14 to 16 hours a day in a coal mine with a little candle on their foreheads. And if you could guess, the life expectancy for these poor children was abysmal. And child labor wasn't limited to coal mines. It was also in textile mills and any sort of factory you could imagine. And it, shortened many, many lives, lots of potential loss there. So that's another progressive era issue. Where these workers lived, even if as adults, was an area of concern. This is, I can't remember the name of the alley, but this is an alley on the right-hand side that is basically one of the highest crime rates in the world in New York. You can see these guys basically looking at the photographer and, no private space, that sort of thing. Same thing in this image over here. When I do this lecture in class, I've had students make an effort to try to count how many people are actually in this image. This is in New York as well, in a tenement. And oh gosh, I think it's one, two, three, four, five, six people, seven people I see, because there's also a foot right here. Often, what would happen in a tenement, this is probably only half the residents of the unit. The other half were working the day or the night shift. And when these folks went to work, they would take the boots of the person that was going to take their bed and then just swap positions because it was easier to afford surviving, frankly. So that's another issue the progressives are trying to deal with back in the Gilded Age. This is the streets of New York again. And there's a dead horse in the street, a bunch of children playing near it. The older kid right here is in charge of these younger kids. And the part of this image that breaks my heart is not the dead horse, which students usually notice first. It's this small child walking off entirely on their own, and nobody's minding them. There's carts in the streets. Oh, fun fact, the cobblestones, I'll show you what they're, oh, it's not on this one. In any case, the cobblestones on these streets were cobbled, with big grooves in it because of all the horse excrement that was produced by horse-drawn travel. So basically, like you go to an old town section of a city, like downtown Holyoke, if you've ever been down there, you got cobblestone streets, just kind of like, oh, this is cute, except it's actually kind of disgusting because those cobbles are meant to catch poop. So tenements, this is a cartoon showing that they're death traps. This is Jack and the Wall Street Giants. Big corporations control most of the wealth. This is actually a drawing of Wall Street, if you've ever been to New York. This is Trinity Church, where Alexander Hamilton is buried. Fun fact. So this is basically the impact of centralized wealth on people's lives. So control of credit, and they're snuffing out candles that say, things like hopes and dreams. It's lost potential is what this effectively is the issue. So, who were the progressives and what beliefs do they share? The first bullet here, basically the modern society causes issues for folks. So let me just see progress, and this down below says the steamroller. Yes, we have a new society with lots of new and shiny things, but not everybody is actually benefiting from it. The basic belief of the progressives of the late 19th century is that the government can reform society to work in a more orderly way. They lift an idea from Catholicism, which is social justice, and the idea is that you should have people equitably sharing with the benefits of society. And this is different than the social Darwinistic idea where those on the top deserve it because natural selection or societal selection allows them to do so. This is different than the populist group because the populists were mostly people from the Midwest, farmers, mostly male. Progressives were, in many cases, and in fact, probably the majority of cases, led by women, which is a new and exciting thing in this time period. It makes sense that women were in charge of many of these progressive movements because being disenfranchised, not being allowed to vote or participate in positions of power made it so there was a real awareness of how important change was. It's the whole idea that if you're benefiting from a system, you're not likely to try to knock it down was relevant back then too. So this gentleman here is named, is named Boss Tweed. And he's one of the, he's effectively one of the problems the progressives were trying to solve. If you look at heading B right here, he was in charge of the political machine in New York City, which effectively made it so, although New York was a democracy, the government was very thoroughly corrupt in a very organized way. Local bosses would basically give people favors in order to gain their votes. It was common for somebody like Boss Tweed here to, let's say in an immigrant neighborhood, if you wanted a job, you would be handed a ballot that you would fill out, as well as your, congratulations, you have a job letter. And so this is basically all for the benefit of those in charge of the organization. And the language the word that's used to describe this kind of skimming off the top of the government's coffers is called graft. And the problem with corruption in government, when people steal from the government, is they're stealing from everybody who contributes to that government, meaning they're stealing from everybody because government is of the people in the United States and countries that are democracies. In material issues, people like Boss Tweed would basically fail to provide paved streets, clean water, safe housing, trash collection, lit streets, police and fire services. Because, he'd be lining his own pockets. Tweed became one of the wealthiest people in New York basically by stealing from the people and winning elections, his cronies winning elections because they bribed folks effectively to do so. Many folks wanted to basically try to bust the trusts, which is, again, the idea that large corporations are another issue. So you've got corrupt government, you've got too big of companies, and these too large of companies would get folks like Tweed to basically do their bidding if, say, I don't know, they wanted to build a slaughterhouse next to the tenement housing or something and get people sick. This is a time period where journalists start to make a huge difference in the way people perceive these problems. So this gentleman down here is a genuine American hero. His name is Thomas Nast. This is his studio, and he's a cartoonist. Many, many, many of the political cartoons from the Civil War, where Nast would basically try to advocate against slavery up until this Gilded Age progressive era time period, were drawn by Mr. Nast. And so he is just really effective at kind of poking holes at the powerful. Here's one of his most famous and earliest of his cartoons. You've got that gentleman I showed you the picture of earlier, Boss Tweed, up here in the stands as a Roman emperor. And the symbol of his organization, Tammany Hall, was a tiger. And down below, you've got a broken ballot box. So back in the late 19th century, ballot boxes were round clay balls you smash open like a piggy bank at the end of the election. It's smashed. Lady Liberty is being mauled by the Tammany tiger. So what's the impact of this government corruption? Well, there goes your democracy. It's been destroyed for the amusement of the masses and this Roman emperor type figure. Similar thing right here. Here's Tweed, the power behind the throne. This is a reference to like the Holy Roman Empire and just basically monarchies in Europe. This one's super creepy, which is why I kept it. We know nothing about stolen vouchers. Too thin. We're innocent. And just basically everyone shifting blame about whose fault all this corruption is. This cartoon right here is, I think, probably one of the better ones to kind of explain this concept of graft. So you've got a society where, I'm just going to start on the image on the bottom. You got a man stealing bread. It's a bakery. His family is hiding behind the corner. The cops are hitting him with sticks. You've got Boss Tweed up here walking to the New York City Treasury with money in his pockets, and the police officers are saluting him. So, wholesale, if you can afford it, you can have the police saluting you as you steal money. If you can't afford bread to feed your family, then you're going to be brutalized. And then over here, who stole the people's money, and everyone is blaming everyone else because there's so much graft and corruption in the government. Again, Nast was not always subtle. This is Boss Tweed with a bag of money as his head. So Tweed had been able to successfully basically, steal from the city of New York for years and years and years, but he hated Nast. And he said that, they can write any article they want. My constituents can't read, but they can see those darn pictures in the newspapers. And so he was really taken down by, again, cartoons. And eventually, both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, again, they absorb populist elements. This is a tiger hunt for the Tammany Hall tiger. By the way, you can see that Tammany Hall was backed by ethnic Irish with Little Shamrock because lots of immigrants couldn't get jobs in more white Anglo-Saxon Protestant areas. So there's also an immigrant element here. But all the Republicans are hunting this corruption because it's been something that's been shown to be politically popular because people like Nast made it popular. So Tammany Hall does get destroyed, and it's effectively by election. That's the only way you can deal with corrupt government is by kicking the bums out of office. This is actually the physical Tammany Hall. It's in New York. It still exists. See? It's a theater now. Corruption basically means that you have inequality in your society. Most corrupt countries have the most inequality in as far as income and between the rich and the poor. So we're in the better end of the spectrum, although not as good as, say, Scandinavia or Germany or Canada. Okay. In addition to political cartoonists like Thomas Nast, there's also the muckrakers, who include folks like this gentleman right here, S.S. McClure, who was a genius, but also just a incredibly difficult person to work for. He was always hunting for the story. He would work, 22-hour days, and then for 3 days in a row, then sleep for a week. Like, the guy had a lot of kind of manic energy. But what a muckraker is a journalist who views their job not like the yellow press just to sell newspapers, but as a means for uncovering the truth about society and encouraging action about it. Teddy Roosevelt, so-called progressive populist, claimed, he kind of gave him the name. Yeah, they saw a racing horse that won a race in a stable. They grab a muckrake to try to examine its manure and find out what's wrong. And this is part of, Teddy Roosevelt's playful relationship with the press. There's a book called Shame of the Cities that basically exposes the political machines in not just New York, but St. Louis and Philadelphia and other cities. The photographer Jacob Riis kind of does what Thomas Nast does with drawings, with pictures, and writes a book called How the Other Half Lives, showing the poverty in those tenements. That image I showed you earlier was from that book. Ida B. Wells here, she's a pretty remarkable woman. She is a women's suffrage advocate. She also dedicated much of her time to anti-imperialist actions. She led a boycott of the 1893 World's Fair, where every great power came together and basically, amongst other things, had black people in cages for the amusement of the masses, from the colonies. She led a boycott of this World's Fair in Chicago. And her main issue was trying to get Congress to pass an anti-lynching bill that they failed to pass until your lifetime. Senator Cory Booker and Tim Scott of New Jersey and Tim Scott of South Carolina, both African American, only passed an anti-lynching bill and Vice President Kamala Harris, Vice President-elect, was also involved with that. In 2019, this bill finally passed. So Ida Tarbell is another muckraking journalist, another woman who exposed the Standard Oil Company and basically the pollution and the corruption coming from this very, very large oil company owned by John D. Rockefeller. Miss Tarbell's dad had actually been driven out of business by Rockefeller's goons, who threatened to light his house on fire if he didn't sell his oil business to them. Nellie Bly is this remarkable woman. She was 19 at the time, and she got herself institutionalized in what was then called an asylum, and she wrote a book called 10 Days in a Madhouse to expose the abuses of the mentally ill. Then, and it helped create a system where dumping cold water on people who were screaming was no longer a way to try to snap them out of their hysteria, as they put it. She then wrote a travelogue that basically inspired the book Around the World in 80 Days. And again, a 20-year-old woman traveled the world by herself back in 1905 and published it in newspapers. Huge, change as far as what women's roles could be in society. John Spargo, an immigrant, a stonecutter, a Vermont socialist, basically was the guy that made Americans of middle and upper class status aware of how bad child labor was. Nellie Bly over here, this is her on her world journey. Here's John Spargo of Vermont. Nellie Bly eventually gets married to a millionaire and starts selling steel barrels, which is kind of funny. Jacob Riis over here, again, he's the photojournalist. Here's Ida Tarbell, and here's Lincoln Stevens. So these are three of the most famous journalists of their time period, and they all are very, very dapper. Okay, now this is Ida Tarbell's, one of her cartoons in her book, basically showing John Rockefeller as another horrible snake, destroying kind of everything. So this is just the history of muckraking. It still goes on. Basically, between World War II and 1970, there was not a lot of criticism of the government in journalism because it was the Cold War. But beyond that, we started with the rise of the internet to have a slightly more critical press. Some of these journalists also wrote books. There's this book called Sister Carrie about a country girl who moves to the city, becomes a mistress to a rich man, eventually becomes the most famous actress of her day, but her material wealth still leaves her feeling empty inside. You've got The Jungle, again, which upset everybody in America about how nasty the meatpacking industry was, the slaughterhouses. I think I made you guys take that book home this year. We will probably take some glimpses at it eventually, but it's got some horrifying images in it. The Octopus by Frank Norris basically says how the railroad companies dominate people's lives, and I Lo Leroy is a novel that describes the black experience during Reconstruction and just frankly the open racism of the time period. There is an idea called the social gospel. So much of progressive era ideology has a Christian kind of angle to it. The idea that you should take care of the poor and you should do right on this world so good things can happen in the future is really baked into this. Jane Addams, who's depicted right here, created the movement of settlement houses, and she's known amongst many, many other titles as the first social worker. And so what she did is she graduated from I can't recall either Smith or Mount Holyoke or one of the other seven sisters, and founded the Hull House, which helped immigrants learn English and get them jobs in cities like Chicago. Helped found the NAACP, the ACLU, worked for women's suffrage, became the first woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and frankly, she's one of my kind of historical heroes. This woman is amazing. And I actually toyed with doing this entire unit as a Jane Addams unit, but I felt like that would be a little indulgent. The Supreme Court, just like kind of now, isn't always in touch with the social movements of the time and did things like prevented folks from banning child labor because they thought it was unconstitutional. You may be aware from middle school, I believe Miss Gill probably had you look at it, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire Factory. This was a factory fire in which, very horrible story short, a bunch of women, mostly Jewish immigrants, were working inside this building in New York, in lower Manhattan. The doors were locked from the outside. A fire starts. The male owners of the factory go up to the top of the building, don't tell their workers there's a fire, and jump away, escape, and hundreds of women burned to death inside the building. People on the streets of New York saw this happen, and that helped lend some force to the drive to get rid of folks like the Tammany Hall political machine in unsafe working conditions. Progressives also reformed the government specifically. So the idea that you want to get rid of the political machines and you want to make government efficient. Some folks in, say, Milwaukee, this is called sewer socialism. The idea being, well, if you want to have a government that works for the people and economy, you got to make sure the sewers are efficient and the government runs well. There are publicly owned corporations which replace private companies in many cities in this Commonwealth, including in the cities of Chicopee, Holyoke, and South Hadley. Their electric companies are owned by each individual city. Where I live in Greenfield, I'm recording this lecture and talking to you folks on a city-owned internet service called GSET. So the state of Nebraska, all of their electricity is produced by the Nebraska State Power Company. So, and you can see their evidence right here from their website is they have cheaper electrical rates than any of their neighboring states because they have a government-run, a socialistic, electric company producing their power. This is something that is hard to kind of imagine because we just live in this world. Direct primaries of political candidates make it so the political parties no longer are just nominating their friends to be political officers. There was primaries this year in the presidential election. That's because of the progressive era. And again, so there are many, many women who are in charge of various progressive movements. But on the national level, it's mostly men because women didn't have the right to vote until 1920. There's this gentleman here named Fighting Bob La Follette who turns Wisconsin into a laboratory for democracy. Part of the reason the state of Wisconsin has one of the best education systems in the country, outside of New England and the West Coast. Governor Hiram Johnson of California, he reads the book The Octopus and basically smashes the monopoly on land and water by the railroad companies out in the West. The two, Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, Teddy a Republican, Wilson, a Democrat, both try to claim their parties are that of progress. And you end up with a situation where everybody running for president in 1914 is a progressive, which is a really remarkable. There are no conservative candidates for president in 1914 because both the Democratic and the Republican parties have been taken over by this movement. And that's that. Next section is going to be women's suffrage. Give me one moment.